Hello, everybody. Welcome. We got a fun event tonight during a slightly somber time here in our politics, but we can have fun tonight with Tom, and we'll get going here in just a minute. Thank you all for coming. And yeah, I'm excited. We have a good turnout tonight, Tom, and appreciate you coming by.
Yeah, no, it's exciting to be here.
Here in Hopium land. Now you've entered the land of Hopium.
It's been
We
too long since I've been in the hopium den.
we spread hopium here at in our when we gather together with this wonderful community of fellow optimists and pragmatic optimists. I'd like to think of ourselves. And I joke, Tom, or I don't joke, but the way that we talk about hopium here is that hopium is hope with a plan, right? We didn't just hope that
I
the
love that.
2022 election would be good, but we actually set about to make it so, right? And the red wave would have come if it wasn't for all these people all around the country who decided they weren't going to let their country slip away. And so, that's the way, we think. Hope Karen said hopiates. I'm not sure I'm going to go with hopiate. I haven't, Karen, I haven't been able to.
I like that.
I know I haven't been able to when I write every morning, I end up resorting to fellow optimists, which is not exactly right. We'll figure this out.
Hello, hopiates.
Opiates. Sounds a little bit too much like opiate. And so but I think, later this year, I'm going to try to start getting into merch because we'll have Hopium Chronicles merch. I think we've got to move in that direction for everybody. Let's get, and Julia has a good hopefuls. I kind of like hopeful. Hopefuls is good. Hopiers. And then, we've got Jim says it's Simon and Tom back together. It's bigger than Jake and Elwood getting the band back together. And hopium of the masses. Merch. Yes, Claudia, let's do merch. I'm gonna work on merch. That's gonna be one of our.
You gotta have the merch.
I know. I've never been a big merch guy, but it's time. I think it's time. Okay, let's get going. Tom, welcome. Thanks everybody for being here. Simon Rosenberg, fellow optimist, hopeful guy here at Hopium Chronicles. We've got a really special event here tonight. Tom Bonier, who is a dear friend and who I spoke to 27 times a day, I think, from the spring of 22 on to election day. Tom and I ended up really collaborating in a wonderfully creative and productive way last cycle. I mean, I couldn't have done, most of the analysis that I did, challenging the idea that red wave was coming. I mean, Tom was right there with me. We were partners in all this. I used the data from Target Smart that gave us unprecedented windows into politics. And also I learned so much from him. I mean, he knows a lot more about this stuff. I'm pretty good at math, but he understood a lot more about polling and really was, I think what we did together was really important, and I'm really proud of it. It's some of the most important work I think I've ever done in my life. And I think it put me on the path to being here with all of you. I mean, the experience of fighting the red wave, and the red wave went away and then it returned, and we were battling with the media every day. That experience really changed me in the sense that I realized that the work we had to do, we had more work to do than I understood in terms of restoring our discourse to a healthy place and really making sure that freedom and democracy prevail here and everywhere. And I just wouldn't really be here without Tom, to be honest. I mean, with all the work we did. So it's great to have him here. I want to just put in one plug that I just want to make sure, because I don't want to have this be mentioned later when not as many people are watching. But last cycle, Target Smart, the company that Tom was the CEO of at the time, and now he's been bumped upstairs a little bit, creates these sites called Target Early, which it's like a public utility where you can see into voting patterns in ways that we didn't have. Without it, you wouldn't know. And so in the early vote, part of the reason I think got the early vote so right was that we had an unprecedented tool to be able to look into the early vote over time. And I just want to once again thank Tom and the whole Target Smart team for spending a lot of money and time in building these public utilities that allow, regular people to see into the voting in their own places that in ways that you couldn't do before. And so I just want to, before we get into it, acknowledge that there's an enormous public service that Tom and Target Smart have committed to, and they're going to hopefully have the Virginia upsite in the next few days. But anyway, Tom, welcome, and I want to just welcome to the Hopium world, and I really just I just wanted, I framed this as a discussion about how the election in 2022 changed post Dobbs, and how we're still sort of in the same political environment, the same election. And we were a year ago at this time, we were spending an enormous amount of time together. And we haven't talked in a while, to be honest, right? Like we're off doing our thing. And I just want to bring you back to reflect on, this idea that we pushed, which is that everything changed in the spring of 2022. It was going to be a close competitive election, ended up being that way. We've seen sort of a similar trend in 2023. Just reflect on all that for us and spend some time talking to people about, what you're seeing, what your feeling is about where things are, lessons learned from last year, all that stuff. And welcome. It's great to have you here, buddy.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you so much for having me here. Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And everything you said, I could echo in return. It, certainly is you and I experienced, it was a lonely path to walk at times leading up to the 2022 election. And, and that can be scary. And I think being able to work with you and to gut check numbers and analysis along the way and to sort of reinforce that we were staying true to the numbers. A lot of people have said since the election, I think both you and I talk about, oh, well, you predicted the election accurately. And I think we always push back a little bit, say we're not in the business of predictions. What we did is we reported on what was happening and how the general conventional wisdom was getting it wrong. And I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about what that looks like now and to your question in terms of what we're seeing. But I think that's such an important distinction. I also want to say it's so great to be here with all of your people and whatever collective name. It's great to see so many people here on a Wednesday night in October. And I don't know if off years really exist anymore. And it's not an off year, as we'll discuss, and so many important races coming up. But it's great to see this level of intensity and enthusiasm. And so I'm thankful to have the opportunity to be here with everybody. Yeah, I think, when we think about last year, and I'm gonna, Simon, you do such a wonderful job sort of reminding people and telling that story. So I'm not going to retell that story more than to sort of remind people at the indicators that gave us that level of confidence in terms of what we were talking about. And in general, the notion was that we were relying less, not disregarding polls, but relying less on the polls that were driving a lot of the media, a lot of the reporting up to that point, and relying more on what actions people were taking. So we were looking at special elections. We were looking at voter registration data. We were looking at primary elections, ballot initiatives, campaign finance data, all of those things. Those were, and more, frankly, but those are the elements that we were looking at. As we got closer to the election, we were looking at the early vote data, because we could say, well, look, the polls are saying this, but we're looking at, in the end, tens of millions of votes and looking for signs of variations in intensity leading up to that election. And that's what really gave us the confidence. There was a question that you and I faced, I think, a lot after Labor Day. And you've talked about this a lot, where there were some bad polls that came out for Democrats after Labor Day. For a while, people were sold on the notion that Dobbs changed everything. And then those polls come out and everyone went back. And as you say, the red wave was back on. And there was this notion that maybe Democrats had overplayed their hand on the issue. Maybe Democrats hadn't been talking about the economy enough. Maybe Dobbs had faded. And so here we are now, well over a year. We're 16 months, almost 16 months since the Dobbs decision was handed down. And what I am seeing in the evidence, and I'd love to talk about this with you. I think you've done a better job than anyone in lifting this up. It'd be good to sort of just at least quickly go through the evidence that we've been looking at this year. But that all the evidence that we are seeing is that not only has the salience of the issue, and the issue is really, there's two elements of this, right? There's the issue in terms of abortion rights as the more narrow issue, but more broadly, I think what it congeals in the minds of so many voters is a repudiation of Republican extremism. That issue is more salient now than it was even then and last November. And I think there are two common sense reasons for that, and then we can get into the evidence. One is people now have 16 months of lived reality of this. And to the extent that we are all, I think, in some ways optimists, and when we deal with tragedy and trauma, as we did with the Dobbs decision being handed down, I think there's a natural human element to try to believe, oh, it's not going to be as bad as we fear. Even if we don't say those words out loud, we hope that that's the case. And I think everything we've seen is that, no, it's absolutely worse, that lived reality. And then two, to the extent that it connects in the minds of voters the notion of Republican extremism, well, the Republican Party has only become more extreme and more dysfunctional, as we're seeing even this afternoon within the Capitol, where they're, I guess, still trying to figure out who the Speaker of the House is going to be. So the evidence, when we talk about that, you've talked a lot about these special elections in places, well, not just special elections, but elections, ballot initiatives, Supreme Court elections like Wisconsin. Wisconsin, as we all know, is a state, if you go back decades, consistently, elections are decided there statewide by a point or two. The fact that the progressive justice won there by such a wide margin is something that should catch everyone's attention. Simon, you've talked a lot, shared these numbers and the analysis on, if you look at the sum total, if you look at the average of special elections at state legislative districts and beyond, that there is a consistent, persistent overperformance of previous Democratic benchmarks, whether you're looking at the Biden performance or previous state legislative races across the country. When we look at the Ohio vote, on the vote before the vote, so to speak, the Republican attempts to make it impossible to enshrine protections for abortion rights, and how wide of a margin that effort failed by, you're seeing, again, not the issue and this notion that you've been talking about, this sort of two election notion, and seeing that spreading. We're not seeing it fading. We're actually seeing it increasing. I will say, and we can pivot here, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. I think the one thing we have to bear in mind is that this isn't a magical salve that cures all ills. It doesn't mean that these races aren't competitive. It doesn't mean that it happens magically everywhere. As we saw, again, I think that the two elections takeaway from the November 2022 election is, to me, the most important. And, you know, I've tried to sum it up in my own words when I think the way you put it more simply is probably the best: inside the battleground and outside the battleground. But to me, there were two elements that had to be present for Democrats to overperform in that election. One was a perception of threat, and two was perception of opportunity. They had to believe and feel that there was a threat from Republican extremism, and they had to believe and feel that there was an opportunity by the act of voting to do something about it. So the states where it was most clear, like in Michigan, where you had a ballot initiative on abortion rights, but you also had candidates who were leaning into this notion that Democrats are doing what is good and what is right for this country, or in that case for the state of Michigan, and Republicans are extremists. And so that's why you saw that overperformance in places like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, and elsewhere. That was the common thread in my mind, were those two elements. So I believe we've seen that lesson internalized to a large extent, but it's still not everywhere, right? And we think about upcoming races, the extent to which we are putting that learning into practice to ensure that we're mobilizing our voters. The news is good, but there's still more work to be done.
I'm going to change the way people see us here in a second. Just give me I'm still learning my way through, I think, as we all are, Zoom. But Talk a little bit about, I get a lot of questions. I leaned on you and Stephen Claremont and others, Anand Amandi, our dear friend, last cycle, that, we would go in and rip apart polls and try to figure out why certain polls were saying certain things. And, you have much more experience with polling, and as does Stephen. But, I get a lot of questions about how come the race is so close right now? What does it mean? We're 13 months out, almost 13 months out, or almost a year out, right? What should people, and also let's just talk for a minute about the problem with polling, right? And that, part of what I think, if all of you haven't read the New York Times piece that features our work that came out in December of 2022, it was a front page New York Times story on the fake red wave. The New York Times, to me, made the most important point of all about polling and what's happened with polling, which is that the low response rate has made it very expensive. And so to do high quality polling, it's costing a lot of money. And so people aren't doing it. It's really almost that simple. And that there are the ability to get a quality sample is costing so much, and you have to do so much waiting and all the magic that goes in the back, right, to make it all like making wine, right? It's not all the pure grapes, is to make the poll come out, that the expenses of it, because of low risk, people aren't responding to polls. So to get a good sample, you have to keep calling people or going on the internet and getting people to respond. That's creating less high quality polls, fewer polls in general, right, overall, and creating an opportunity for Republican leaning polls to shape our understanding more. That there's been also an incredible increase, because there's just unlimited money on the right, that there's been all these now polling firms that are just dropping polls on the, if you go into 538's average, I think a few years ago, it would be 60-70% media polls, 20% Democratic polls, 20% Republican polls. And now it's like, 50% media polls, 40% Republican polls, 10% Democratic polls. Because when we poll, we do it for campaigns. We don't we don't do polling just for the sake of polling, because we used to rely on media polling to do that. And then we had our own private polling that we did that we never released. And the Republicans have created this whole new sort of thing that didn't used to exist, which is constant, like Rasmussen, this constant flooding of the zone of polls that are paid for and run by Republicans that are now getting ingested into the averages. And so even just, I went and looked at 538 today, it's at least a third, 40% of the polls that are in the 538 averages are all Republican, right? They're all controlled by Republicans. It's Republican. And so, but that's because of the theory of 538 where everything averages out in the end. But it's just, to me, one of the things that is still shocking to me is that how can we as Democrats accept polling averages where 30-40% of the inputs are coming from the other guys? It's just, there's an illegitimacy to it now that didn't really used to exist. And so just reflect on all that and help people understand, because this is probably among the most common questions that I get, when I talk, and I just want to hear your thoughts on all this.
Yeah, understandably. And thanks for the question, because this is one of the things that drives me perhaps the craziest when it comes to the things that we have to push back on. There is this saying for years, once 538 came into existence, maybe a decade ago or more, and repeated up through the election last year, which was trust the average. And it was this notion that, well, okay, here's a poll and it looks obviously wrong. It's got, a sample that couldn't be defended in terms of who they talked to. The result just doesn't pass any sort of sniff test, but they'd say, trust the average, meaning throw it into the average. And if you look at the average of the polls, it will do well. And one of the things that maybe disappoints me the most when we think about what we've learned and haven't learned from the election last year and previous elections is there's now a conventional wisdom that, well, actually the polls were pretty good. Polls were pretty good last year. And it's the sort of thing where, yes, from 100 miles out in space, the polls were pretty good. If you look at the average of all the polls across all the Senate battlegrounds, and you average out Democratic error and Republican error, meaning, polls that were too Democratic or too Republican, Yeah, that total average is actually very close to the actual result. When you look at it in a practical sense, in terms of how we are internalizing these polls and looking at it state by state, the polls were not very good. As you sounded the alarm, and continue to share this story, which I think is incredibly important, the poll averages were skewed. They're intentionally gamed. And so you had situations where states like Washington State, New Hampshire, states that never were actually going to be competitive for Republicans, the poll averages were gamed to make it look um, they were competitive, and money went there and attention went there and a sense of momentum was created there. And this was believed by very smart data analysts, who the media relies on to get these things right. And so this revisionist history of, well, the polls were actually quite good, depends on a whole lot of torturing of logic, which is disappointing to me. In terms of the polls now, number one, we're still hearing this. Trust what we've seen a lot of outlier polls recently. Number two, I will say, for the most part, I don't pay attention to these national polls. I certainly don't pay attention to head-to-head horse race presidential polls. I only started even looking at them in the last handful of weeks because I finally got sick of so many of these polls actually getting attention from smart political reporters and smart people in our space who are panicking about them. And beyond the flaws with the polls and everything you said in terms of response rates and the difficulties and getting a good sample and the bias in terms of who's putting polls out there, there's just the issue that if you ask someone about Biden versus Trump, that question is thought of in a very different lens now than it will be when someone goes into the polling place, in election on election day or before, as we get closer to the election next year. It's just the reality. People on the Democratic side may feel free, to express their desires or whims or hopes and how they respond to that question, whereas Republicans are so sycophantic at this point that they're going to say they're there for Trump. And you see that in those results. I don't believe for a moment that means those voters aren't going to vote for President Biden when it comes to that choice. The last point I want to make on this, when we talk about the polls, our polling team did something really interesting last week, and I shared this on Twitter, last towards the end of last week. A question that gets a lot of attention for some reason. You and I have talked about this. It's one of the worst questions in polling, but the media, not everyone, I know it's not a monolith, but a lot of folks do love this question, which is the right track, wrong track, or right track, wrong direction, depending on how it's phrased. Where you ask voters, do you think things in this country are generally headed in the right direction or off on the wrong track? And it's used as a way to say that, doom and gloom, woe is me, things are so bad for President Biden and Democrats because 3/4 of Americans think things are headed in the wrong direction while Democrats are in the White House. So our polling team did the super interesting thing where they asked that question, but they asked a follow-up that never is asked, to my knowledge, where they asked, okay, well, for people who say things are headed in the wrong direction, who do you blame? Do you blame Democrats and Biden, or do you blame Republicans and Trump? And more voters, by pretty decent margin, say that, yeah, things are headed in the wrong direction. It's Republicans and Trump's fault, which makes sense, right? When you think about everything we've talked about, when we think about Dobbs and January 6th and dysfunction and extremism and everything they're doing in the House now, it makes sense that more people would blame Republicans and Trump. But it's not how, and I actually Googled this then that night, did a Google News search to see what the headlines were on other polls. I've talked about this. Universally, when they talk about this poll, they frame it as bad news for Democrats. So, context is important too. But, if I was to offer any advice to the folks here participating in this conversation, it would be, don't worry about the polls right now. I mean, we need to be loud about it. And when these averages are being gamed again and that sort of thing, we do need to call it out. But in the end, I hear from a lot of people online generally who get really stressed out about these polls and are worried that it's showing that Democrats are doomed. Just as they didn't show that last year, they're not showing that now. Pay attention to the indicators of actual intensity. Those are the ones that are going to tell us how things are going.
So two things I want to say about that. First is One of the reasons that there were many reasons why I was much more optimistic about the election in 2022 than many, but one of them had to do with inflation. And, we were told that inflation was going to kill Biden and that, this was the worst thing that had ever happened. And it was, and on the inflation issue, when you asked the second question, it was always the most important issue, but then you asked, who do you blame for high inflation? Only about a third of voters blame Biden, and many voted high gas prices on OPEC and Russia and Saudi Arabia. People picked COVID and supply chain, right? And so there was not this incredible, this next connection that yes, inflation was the most important issue, but I didn't blame Biden for it. And therefore, what I wrote about, and I started writing about this at the end of 2021, was that I think people are misreading what is going on with the public with inflation, which is that, yeah, you can be really concerned about it, but that doesn't mean that you think Biden is the cause of it, because he actually only played a small role in the inflation that's happened. I mean, inflation that's happened, it's a global phenomenon. It's happened, all throughout the West. And so these kinds of things, I mean, one of the things you and I need to talk about is whether or not we actually try to do some strategic myth busting around these common questions that I think are, interesting without being informative, right? I mean, you can have data that's interesting data, but it actually doesn't really tell you, it has nothing to do with what's actually happening in the election, right? The right track, wrong track is one of those questions. I want to go back, if you could just remind everybody about the indicators of intensity. What we talked about in 2022, I think the big insight that we had, which by the way was roundly rejected by all the smart people, right? That you came up with this concept that there were 4 basic indicators of intensity that we were witnessing, and that we were seeing those indicators consistently show up well for Democrats and not show up for Republicans, which was surprising, right? There was never, it was very consistent. And what we look for, everybody, in data analysis and polling and election analysis, is all the data has to be pointing in the same direction for it to be true. I mean, if you've got some data saying Democrats are doing well and other data that says Republicans are doing well, you can't make a conclusion that things are all going in one direction. In 2022, all the data from May, June on to election day was all pointing in the same direction, which is heightened Democratic intensity, no Republican intensity, right? So talk about this, I think, which is in some ways our most important contribution last cycle, which is the way that you described it, which is these four indicators of intensity.
Yeah, no, thank you. If you actually go back to that time period, you had all of them sort of in this compressed time period, which is why we were looking at them. June 24th, the Dobbs decision. I personally, and this is where Simon and I started to connect on it, started looking at voter registration data in Kansas, because that was going to be the first test of it. So voter registration data, the notion was, well, if people are mobilizing around the issue of Republican extremism and specifically around the anti-abortion rights movement, you would presumably see people motivated to go out and register to vote who had voted. And that's what we saw, right? We talked about it, how in the period between the Dobbs decision, June 24th, and the registration deadline in Kansas for that early August vote, which was mid-July. So it was only about 3 weeks worth of data. Women accounted for 70% of registered voters. And I will repeat that stat until the day I die, because it is the most remarkable thing you could possibly see. Registration is only part of the equation, obviously, because if people register to vote, there is a fairly safe assumption that people who intentionally register to vote are going to vote at a much higher rate. And it's true in Kansas. They voted at a much higher rate than people who were already registered to vote. But that was the second index that we were looking at, was turnout. For the most part, the turnout that we were looking at was in special elections, but we had elections like Kansas too. But you remember back to New York 19, the Alaska special election, these congressional elections that were Republicans were expected to win. Democrats won them. So that's a pretty good index. And that all we would do and look at that is again, that you were leading the way in this messaging, was to say, look, if a red wave is coming, we haven't seen it yet. and that
Yeah.
this is not consistent with previous. This is not the first time we're having elections in this country. It would be unusual to have an election year where these things are happening prior to it, and then it ends up in a red wave. The other element that we looked at was the finance data, right? The sense of the grassroots mobilization. Are people giving to campaigns? And what we saw was that Democrats and progressives were far outpacing Republicans. And then the last phase of that was the early vote, which now last phase, it started in mid-September, where we were starting to look at data. You mentioned Target early, and as you said, if I can give a secondary plug for that, because I know we've got hundreds of people here, which is awesome. But for those who weren't around at the beginning, we will be launching that. Our team at Target Smart just does incredible work. They will be launching that. It'll be a targetearly.com. It's a free public site, and you'll be able to look at the Virginia early vote data, with some context that you probably haven't seen elsewhere. But yeah, those are the elements. I think I got them all, Simon.
Yeah, it was first the performance in the specials. It was then the voter reg data, the campaign finance data, and the early vote, which were all showing heightened Democratic intensity. And as we look to 2023, if those of you who are Hopium folks know that I've been talking a lot about how we've seen this continued heightened intensity. I mean, we won in Colorado Springs and Jacksonville, Florida. We weren't supposed to win there. We got to 56% in the Wisconsin Supreme Court race. We got to 57% in Ohio. We got, we've outperformed 2020 now in 27 House and Senate special elections all across the country by 8 points over in an election that we won by 4.5 points. I mean, I remind people that New Hampshire special election just a few weeks ago, that was a district that Trump had won twice. It was Republican held, it was a Republican retirement, and we won by 12 points. And we just have to, as two guys who've been doing this a long time, you just don't see data like that very often. Like those kinds of results are not common to see that kind of big swing. I mean, where there can be a 10, 15, 20 point swing towards the Democrats. And this is why I think Tom and I are both, feel good about where we are right now. I mean, I keep saying I'd much rather be us than them. That's my phrase that I've been using since the summer of last year. And it continues to be the case. And I just want to put in, just for folks who may be a little bit new, I just want to go through something he had mentioned earlier about the two elections analysis, because our basic view about what happened in 2022 was that there were two elections, and there was a bluer election inside the battleground and a redder election outside. And one of the reasons that the elections were bluer in the battleground was because of the grassroots intensity around fundraising and volunteering, which gave our campaigns unprecedented advantages financially, which allowed them to control the information environment, and then also to push turnout to the upper end of what was possible, which is what we saw in the early vote. I mean, I would often text Tom in the morning when his site would update, and I would say, come on, man, this data can't be so good. Like and I was like, just do a check with your team to make sure I'm not reading this, because I kept expecting the early vote data to get to level out, right? Because it was very positive for us in the beginning. And I think you and I both expected it to get back to something that looked more normal. And it never did. And in fact, in the last week, it got better and better and better for us every day. And I think that you and I were looking at this data every day and being like, it can't really be. I mean, this is not going to be a red wave. We were looking at something that looked like a blue wave. We never used that term, right? Because we didn't want to be more ridiculed than we were, frankly, at the time this all happened. But the important understanding here is that we did so well in these elections, and we outperformed 2020 in Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, Minnesota, Michigan, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania. We got to 59 in Colorado, 57 in Pennsylvania, 55 in Michigan, 54 in New Hampshire. Those would be amazing results in a good year. And they were amazing results in a bad year, right? Where nationally, we actually lost a little bit of ground. And to me, the lesson of this was that we saw this muscle of the Democratic grassroots, right? Where all of the work that you guys do, the postcarding, the calls, the texting, the money that you give, we were able to build this incredible machine in the battleground. And it's done a lot of harm to them, because we've now litigated MAGA in 3 consecutive elections in the battleground, and it's gone very poorly for them. And I think what happened in 2022 is the battleground moved further away from them. than it was even in 2020. And it's another reason why I remain so confident. But a lot of what we saw in the data every day was the result of the work you were doing to push our turnout in the early vote to the upper end of what was possible. It was extraordinary. It was an extraordinary experience, actually, to see all of this. And I wouldn't have been able to see it without Target Early and the great work that Tom's team did to provide us this unprecedented resource, which allowed you not only to look at what was happening today, but it was that day versus the election in 2020 on that day, and in the election in 2018 on that day, broken down by demographics. So you could see the Hispanic wave and women, and you could break it down incredibly granularly because of their amazing company, Target Smart. And, hopefully we're going to have that up. People are asking about Virginia and Ohio. I think both of us, we talked about this beforehand. I think on Virginia, we want to say that we're not really sure. I mean, I think there's, I think he and I are both going to go on the record tonight and saying it's good, but it's not good enough, and we have work to do. And without, because I think both he and I feel like we just don't have enough data to be able to make some kind of, conclusion. I don't think I have any. I don't have any early understanding of Ohio yet, because the early vote just started there. But I think in Virginia, the polling's been good. The early vote is fine. And, but if we want to win in the way we want to win, we got to keep our pedal to the metal and keep working hard, I think is what I think we both agree on that. Tom, do you want to jump in on that at all?
Yeah, thanks. I'll just say a couple quick things on that, because like you say, we're still waiting to have the Target Early site launching. Our team is working tirelessly on that, though that's because that's a public facing thing. It's not something that's direct work for campaigns and candidates. Sometimes it isn't the top priority to get it out there. They're actually working on another very cool thing that I can't talk about yet, but that's that potentially will have an even bigger impact for the benefit of Democrats and progressives. So very excited about that. We'll have more about that. But yeah, so in Virginia, like you say, we don't have that historical context yet. I feel the same way you do. I look at it and I say, well, look, it's not bad. There's some things to feel good about. But one thing that I saw and looking at it, which I'll share it with y'all first, haven't shared this elsewhere, but looking at turnout among African-American voters, strong right now. They're about 14% of the early vote. And it's one area where we do have context. When you look at the early vote just in last year's election, the vote before election day, African-American vote was about 1.5 points lower than that. So that's a positive sign. But it's not all, as positive. It's close. The early vote is a little bit older than I think we'd like it to be at this point. We need to see younger voter mobilization out there. We do know that younger voters, even with the early vote, tend to come out a little bit later. So that's why I'm going to be interested to look at the comparisons to the same point in time, see what we see with younger voters. But that's a key element as well. In terms of women, they're about a little over 54% of the votes cast so far. For context, the final early vote, when you look at the past few election cycles in Virginia, women have tended to be somewhere between 55 and 56% of the votes cast before election day. So again, that's one number that I would look at and say, well, it's good. It needs to be better, to your point. And then the other potential curveball in this analysis that we're paying attention to is at some point, Republicans are going to wake up to the notion that avoiding early vote, just from a strategic perspective, is a huge blunder. And we saw this after the election last year, where Republicans admitted that it likely cost them some very key elections and that they needed to be better about it. We've seen some sign that they're pushing this in Virginia and elsewhere. It's a question of to what extent are they able to break through that sort of party orthodoxy that mail voting is fraud because Leader Trump told them it was. So we'll see. But that's something else that we're going to have to look at in the analysis, is to what extent are we seeing Republicans rebounding slightly there?
Yeah, I mean, the VPAP data, which a lot of people are using, is a very crude data set, because it all it tells you is the turnout in a district. It doesn't tell you the breakdown Democrats and Republicans in the way that we would all, I think that we would want, with a level of certainty that we would want to really know what's happening there. And so I think we talked about this beforehand, and I think we both felt that things are good, but they're not good enough. And the polling has also been good. Listen, one of the things that I think is going to be really interesting, we discussed this a little bit before we got on, is that it's been my view that we've been in sort of one single election since May or June of last year, and that hasn't really changed very much. And that happens in politics, right? But the most important thing is that one of the reasons polling can't predict anything, in part because everything changes in politics. What's been interesting is that we've had a very consistent environment, I think, since the spring of last year. But at some point, that environment is going to start giving away to a new environment, just in the way that we had from the fall of 2021 really until spring of 2022. The environment was Afghanistan, high inflation, and it was a bad environment for us. I mean, this is part of the reason why people believed the red wave was going to come, because Biden's numbers went way down. We were struggling as a party during that period, but then things changed. And you have to, and one of the things that I often say is that no election is like any other election. Every election is sui generis. You need to look at the data of this election. Anytime you hear a commentator talk about how this election is like that election, you should almost immediately dismiss the analysis, because it's just lazy. And no election is like any other election. Every election is unique. And it's why you have to pay attention to the data that's in front of you, not pay attention to sort of notions in your head about what's going on. And to me, I think one of the most interesting things that we're about to see is that I think what happened over the last few weeks, and particularly with what happened in Israel over the weekend, it's going to change the election. I think we're going to, within a few weeks, and I don't know yet how. I mean, will it help us? Will it make people more security minded? What is that going to do in Virginia, right? I think there's the national overlay, which has been really about Biden being a good president, and Democrats doing a good job, and the Republicans being too crazy, which has sort of been the basic structure, could yield to something different. I will say that Biden's performance publicly over the last couple of days has been exemplary, and he's really kicked ass. And I think that right now, to me, it's very possible that what's happening, as horrible as it is in Israel, and our hearts go out to the people of Israel in every conceivable way, that Biden's strong, forceful presidential set of actions that he's taken could actually really start benefiting us in a way, and sort of helping him on what we call in our business the strong leader, weak leader dimension, which is part of what happens with his age, is the way it manifests in polling, is that his age becomes a sign of weak leadership, right? This is what the Republicans are constantly trying to do. And so if he acted forcefully and with strength and decisiveness and effectively, I think it could have a significant impact on the understanding of where we are. And so I think this, my just lay it out there, is that I think this election environment that we've been in is going to change now. We're actually going to be in this sort of next phase, within, I don't know when, right? Within 6 weeks, within a month. But what are your thoughts about that, Tom? I mean, just help people understand the way we think about this, particularly those of us who've been doing this a long time, right? Where you see these ebbs and flows in elections. I mean, for example, in the 2018 midterm, when I was advising the DCCC, we really won the election in the fall of 2017, is when sort of the Republican numbers went way down, ours went up, and the election basically stayed sort of the same all the way through from the fall of 2017 to 2018. It didn't really change all that much. Their screwing up sort of gave us opportunities to take advantage of their, the mess they made on, the tax cuts and the healthcare bill really defined them as being out of touch with the mainstream, and we were able to take advantage of that. So, Tom, just reflect on that a little bit, because I think this is an important insight into the fact that polling can't predict. One of the things Tom and I talk about all the time is anyone who says they can predict the future, I think you should look at them with a little bit askance. I mean, nobody can predict the future. What we can do is we can make reasonable assumptions based on the data that's in front of us. And it'll be interesting. And I get this gut, it's in my gut, Tom, that we may be seeing an evolution of the environment that you and I have been, talking about since last spring.
Yeah, I agree with you. And thank you for driving home that point about polling, because polling at its best, and we're not seeing polling at its best right now. The polling at its best is going to give you an accurate snapshot of where things stand today. Not even today, the last week that the poll was fielded. And to the extent that pollsters try to ask questions about, well, if this would happen, how would it impact your behavior? Those questions are generally useless for a whole number of reasons. But to your point, and it's why the sort of analysis that we have been doing and will continue to do is so important in my mind, because it's constantly taking that temperature of what are we experiencing right now at this moment? What is the trend line? And yeah, I think it would be foolish to not at least consider anytime that there's any sort of substantial, significant change in the status quo, domestically, internationally, something that is catching the attention of the American electorate. It would be foolish to not at least consider the extent to which that's changing the political dynamic in this country. And we are certainly experiencing that now. And to your point, there's not much sense in trying to predict how that will impact things. But rather, the good news is we'll continue to be able to observe this and then connect some of those dots. But yeah, I agree with your instinct on this, that it does at this point feel like this dynamic is shifting, at least somewhat at this point.
At some point, the 2024 election is going to become the 2024 election, right?
Right.
And we weren't just
right with its own dynamic,
with its own dynamic, and not just a hangover from 2022.
Well, and how many elections, to your point, certainly 2 consecutive elections even have the exact same dynamic. That generally doesn't happen. It's 2024 is going to be its own unique election with its own unique dynamic. It may closely resemble 2022. It may be substantially different. It depends on so many different elements. I mean, again, we can report that what we have seen is that this dynamic has persisted and potentially even strengthened. There's the potential for it to continue to strengthen.
Yeah.
But that's not the only option at this moment.
So let me just build on that for everyone to understand the logic here of my get to 55 concept, which is that it's my belief that the Republicans have abandoned demographic and geographic real estate for us that we have to go take away from them, and that we shouldn't be shooting just to get to 51.5, which is what Biden got last time, but to get to 55, with the goal being of having this election be a clear repudiation of MAGA, which will hopefully start to loosen its dark grip on the Republican Party. And I lay out in my memo sort of ways that we can expand, but it's a mindset, right? It's a mindset of expansion. It's not fear, uncertainty, doubt. It's not playing it safe. It's this idea that Joe Biden's been a good president. Country's better off, the Democratic Party is strong, our grassroots is better than it's ever been, and that we can do more. And we've seen that play out, right? We've taken stuff away from them in Florida and Colorado and Wisconsin, and other New Hampshire and other races. And I think that the point I wanted to make about that was that it was something you said now that, of course, I'm forgetting just in my ramble here, is that that we have this opportunity, I think, next year, because I think what's going to happen in my scenario planning, my strategy, right? If you're a chess player, right, you got to move all your pieces. Joe Biden if the economy is doing reasonably well, and if it looks like the world, that he's done a good job in Ukraine and now done a good job in Israel, that, he'll have a very strong case for re-election. And so his ability to pick up points increases. Try to war game out Trump, right, over the next 12 months. I mean, the likely scenario is he keeps going down, right? I mean, he's about to be on trial. He did betray the country in the documents, and an unprecedented betrayal of the United States with the documents case in Mar-a-Lago. He led a Republican Party-wide conspiracy to overturn an election and end American democracy and put a fascist dictator into our country. He also ended he ended Roe, right? This guy has been the worst political figure in our history with no near peer. and he's going to be on trial all of next year for really serious stuff. He's already had a summary judgment against him saying he committed one of the largest financial frauds in the history of the United States. This just happened 10 days ago. And I know that people were like, well, it's not registering. Well, that's what campaigns are for, everybody. What campaigns are for is campaigns take money, they produce advertising, and they have candidates reinforcing it, who take ideas and put them into voters' heads so they understand things better than they did before. Think about what we're going to be able to talk about with voters about what Trump's done, and think about the images. He won't be at rallies. He's going to be in a courtroom, right, over, again and again and again. And so my view is he's much more likely to be at 45, 44% next year than he is to be at 47, 48, 49%, because he's going to continue to degrade. And that's why I think that my greatest worry in some ways of the Democratic Party right now is that we're not being ambitious enough, right? We're not recognizing that we have perhaps a once in a 30-year opportunity to go take away demographic and geographic real estate, or maybe in once every 50 years, opportunity to go take stuff away from them, that we need to make sure that we, start really weakening MAGA to the point where it starts, that Republicans start walking away from it. And we haven't really talked about this very much, Tom, but I love your thoughts, because I think that one of the things we have to get better at as Democrats, and whether it's No Labels or Robert Kennedy or Trump, we have to stop giving people power that they don't have themselves, that they haven't earned themselves. I think we shouldn't view Trump as a strong figure. His party's unbelievably divided. He's the most extraordinary extremist. He's committed an unprecedented number of crimes. I think this stuff's going to matter to voters. I think it mattered in 2022. It mattered in 2020. It mattered in 2018. It's not going to matter to the 40% of the country that's going to be with him no matter what, right? But for the 60% of the country that that is open to us, that's available to us. And I think there's much more available to us now than there usually is in all across the country. We just have to build a politics that allows us to go get all that stuff, right? To get the never Trumper, never MAGAs, to push the youth turnout through the roof, to go back and get some of the Hispanic vote that we've lost, to go do better in rural areas, to understand the politics of abortion and the opportunities it gives us. I think now this is a time for expansion and growth and ambition and offense, and not playing it safe. And that's just part of the reason I'm so optimistic, is that I think what's going to happen to him over the next 12 months is going to be brutal for the Republican Party.
Yeah, again, this is something that I think that I've appreciated, that you've pushed this out there and repeated it, and I think it bears repeating again. When you look at the Republican Party, even prior to Trump, how many times has the Republican presidential candidate won even just a plurality of the popular vote in the last 30 some odd years? Bush in 2004. They were already in trouble as a party of failed ideas before Trump came along. And since then, he drove them off the cliff. And to your point, and I think it's reflected in the polling, there's not much of a logical argument to be made in terms of why a voter is going to be persuadable. Someone who didn't vote for Trump before isn't sure about it, but they're going to get into next year and see him on trial for literally several dozen different offenses and say, yeah, you know what? I'm persuaded. I think that's why you see in the national poll, and if you want to pay attention to anything in the national horse race polls, look at where Trump is stuck. He's got the ceiling that's about 44%, maybe 45%. Yeah. Maybe that means on election day, he could get up to 46%. Are Biden's numbers in most polls in the mid 40s too? It's generally, a few points higher. The difference is, what is the fix that has to be put in place to get Biden and Democrats in a better position versus what Republicans would have to do? And as you say, and I think it bears repeating here, I'd rather be us and them when it comes to that job. Yeah, it couldn't be any more different.
I think they're resigned. I think the Republican Party, what's been extraordinary is that, the only people that have beaten MAGA has been Democrats, right? The Republican Party has lost control of its party to extremists and extremism. However, anytime the establishment runs up against MAGA, they get beat, and we're seeing it happen with the with the Congress right now, where MAGA came in and tore down a Republican speaker, the first time it's ever happened in our history. It's not really clear to me. I mean, we don't have enough time to sort of dwell on this, but I don't know that any Republican can get 217. And there, I mean, we could be without a speaker for a substantial period of time here, and it has to do with the nature of the House and the way it's structured. It's a little bit arcane. If we were a parliamentary democracy, this all would have been fixed by now, and we'd be on the other side. But the House has got, to elect a speaker, you have to get to 217, and if you don't get to 217, you don't become speaker. And I don't, right now I looked at this right before we came on air, is that there are like 8 or 9 Republicans who said they won't vote for Scalise. So he's at like 212, 213 now. And then there's another 5, 6, 7 that are undecided. I mean, if there was a head-to-head vote right now, Hakeem Jeffries would beat, Scalise. And so this is a level, so I think that this cumulative impact of their awfulness and their ugliness and their extremism is going to give us, as political professionals, we have more tools to talk to the American people about how out of the mainstream they are than we've ever had in our history, in our modern history as a party. And it's why I remain so optimistic about, the moment and that we're in. But recognizing that I think that, we're in it. I think the environment's changing. I think that, the issues around Ukraine and sort of these issues that around threat and defense of the country, and are we safe, and how does the world feel, which have been very in the background, are going to become more to the foreground. And it's why what Biden's done, he means he has to manage through it. He's got to go into it. Part of what drove his fall in the polling was the sense of his mismanagement of Afghanistan. And this is now, I think, going to become an opportunity to fix some of that, right? I mean, the way that he's managing that, I think that, so there's no question in my mind, by the way, that for many voters, they lost a little bit of faith in him during the Afghanistan issue in the fall of 21, which was right before the Virginia election, right? So it means to me that he's been given a political opportunity here, that if he does the right thing, and if things get better, and if he defends Israel, and we get these bills through, and the country feels like he's responded in a time of crisis, it could end up really addressing one of the core concerns about him in a way that's going to be, I think, to me, deeply powerful for him in his offering to the American people next year. But anyway, this is all very fresh. I will tell you that it's been, it's been very emotional for me, actually, what's been happening in Israel. I've been riveted on television, and it's an incredible tragedy. And those of you who are Hopium folks know that Amir Taban, who spoke to us a few months ago, has now become sort of a global figure, because he was the guy whose father came and rescued him and his kids, as he's been all over media. I'm going to try to get him back here next week if he has time. I think he lost a family member. I was just reading his Twitter feed today. But I do think that this is going to wake up a lot of people. This is going to bring people into the discourse that had been sitting it out. And so I do think we're going to see a change. Hopefully it's a good change. We'll see what happens. I mean, I think if Biden performs well, he's got a real opportunity here to reassert the strong leader, weak leader dimension of his presidency, which is an area where he needs to get in better shape, in my view. But it will happen if he does the right thing and he's forceful and strong, which I think he has been. It was amazing to me. Last thing, I just want to, this is all very fresh, but yesterday, after his speech on Israel, there were people who had been lifelong critics of Biden, who were involved in Middle East politics, who said it was one of the greatest presidential speeches they've ever heard. And I almost fell off my chair, right? These are Republicans who give Biden no space. He's opened up, he has created an opening for himself with people that were not available to him before, by what he's done over the last few days. And it's going to be fascinating to see how this all plays out. Anyway, we're at our time, Tom. Let me leave you with a final word. I mean, any final thoughts, anything we didn't cover. It's been great. I could talk to you for hours. And so, and, it's been, because we don't talk enough, actually. I
No, we
realized,
don't.
we don't talk
This is
enough.
a reminder for me that we need to talk more. I always learn something, and
Yeah, and I learned from you. I've learned so much from you in the last couple of years. It's been incredible. I mean, I wouldn't, the site and all this work wouldn't exist without the work that we did together last year. And so why don't you bring it home, land the plane, tell us any final thoughts, end with spread a little hopium, whatever you'd like to do. But anyway, it's good to see you, brother. And thanks for coming
yeah,
by tonight.
yeah. Again, thank you so much for having me here. It was awesome to just get a chance to talk with you for the last hour. And yeah, I mean, my hopium for this evening is seeing hundreds of people in here who are tuning into this conversation. I appreciate the comments and questions along the way. I think we were peppering answers in as we went. Yeah, I'll hope to be back in the hopium den. I know you're not going to go with that branding. I'm going to go with it until you. Nature abhors a vacuum.
I know,
I'm going to fill it. So
it's the hopium den. But listen, voting is happening all over the country. As all of you have heard me say here, voting early, day one, a call, a text, a donation now, a vote, a postcard matters more now than it does in 3 weeks. The early activity, pushing our prime voters to vote early, means that the campaigns can move on to address lower propensity voters. One of the reasons the early vote went so well for us in 2022 is that we had a big surge in the early part of the election in the early days, and then the campaigns were able to move into lower propensity voters, which then drove turnout up. And early vote has been a blessing for the Democratic Party. It's allowed, we have more episodic and irregular voters than Republicans do. So now that we have these unprecedented tools, these large, grassroots organizations, all of you, all the amazing work all of you do, we have unprecedented ability now to drive turnout. And it's one of the reasons we keep performing at the upper end of what's possible. We need to do what we need to do now in the elections, the November elections. I'm very focused on Virginia, but all these other elections matter too. Virginia, I think, is the most important, and I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying that because every election matters. But I think this Virginia election has national, will help shape an understanding of the presidential election. And Joe Biden himself called it the first election of the 2024 campaign. So do whatever you're going to do more of it. Everybody, thank you so much. Tom, I'll have you back every few months so we can do a checkup. And I will be, the one thing is that he's starting to, when Target Early comes out, I'll mention it. Any analysis, Tom, you want me to share that you're doing, like that poll, I hadn't seen that, just share with me and I'll throw it out there, on Hopium, and make sure that people get to see your stuff. And yeah, and anyway, good to see you, brother.
Good to see you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.